So my name is Professor Gish. I'm Professor of Honors, and I'm also the director of the Prognosis minor. And I want to welcome you to our Constitution Day lecture for 2024. So by authority of Congress, September 17 has been designated by law as Constitution Day and Citizenship Day. This day commemorates the transmission of the United States Constitution to the 13 states by the President of the Constitutional Convention, George Washington, for official ratification. His letter transmitting the Constitution drafted during that summer in Philadelphia was signed on September 17, 1787. Now, under this law, every educational institution that receives federal funds in a fiscal year is required to hold an educational program about the U.S. Constitution for its students during the week of September 17th. The law further stipulates that institutions should, quote, make plans for the instruction of citizens in their responsibilities and opportunities as citizens of the United States and of the state and locality in which they reside. This event happily fulfills that requirement. Our invited speaker for this Constitution Day and Citizenship Day is Dr. Jacob Howland. Dr. Howland is Professor of Humanities and Provost at the University of Austin. He is also the Dean of the Intellectual Foundations Program. Now, the University of Austin, for those of you who do not know about it, is a brand new university whose mission is to prepare thoughtful and ethical innovators, leaders, public servants, and citizens through open inquiry and civil discourse, and to do so through the study of wisdom from the past, of transformative potential for novel ideas in the present. Similar to the academic mission of the Honors College, Dr. Howland's University seeks to advance learning and understanding of the past and the present through a commitment to excellence in teaching, and thus to prepare students to pursue truth through education, lead meaningful and fulfilling lives, and become responsible, active, informed citizens within our liberal and democratic polity. Not only is Dr. Howland the first dean of the Intellectual Foundations Program, he is one of its founders. He himself is responsible for the constitutional design and content of its curriculum, which comprises the first 2 years of undergraduate education at the University of Austin. Like our own honors foundational course, The Human Situation, the Intellectual Foundations Program aspires to instruct freshmen and sophomores in the tradition of humanity's rich intellectual, scientific, artistic, and cultural inheritance. This education engages students with classic texts and timeless questions to cultivate sound judgment. Like The Human Situation and our Honors College mission, this education equips students with the knowledge of compelling ideas from the past in order to help them see our modern world as an intelligible whole, and to understand how to translate knowing into doing and making in that world. Prior to his current iteration as a university administrator, Dr. Howland was and is a teacher and a scholar. His academic publications include 5 books and many articles, but I'll name just his books. His first 2 books are compelling studies of Plato's Republic. The first is titled The Odyssey of Philosophy, and the second is titled The Paradox of Political Philosophy, Socrates' Philosophic Trial. His third book is a reflection on the relationship between Socratic eros and Christian faith, titled Kierkegaard and Socrates. And that work was followed by his study of Plato and the Talmud, which was published in 2011. His most recent book, which I highly recommend to my students and my colleagues in The Human Situation, is this one, Glaucon's Fate, History, Myth, and Character in Plato's Republic. In this work, Dr. Howland examines how Socrates, in the dialogue of the Republic, strives to persuade Glaucon, Plato's own brother, that the just life of philosophy is preferable to the unjust life of a tyrant. This thoughtful and illuminating inquiry not only explores the temptation of an accomplished young man to seek out a life of political influence, but also reveals in general the tension between politics and philosophy itself. And that is the theme of his talk today, I think, on the Constitution, the State, and the Death of Politics. Dr. Jacob Howland.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gish. It's been a real pleasure for me to visit the Honors College here. I've been greatly impressed with the curriculum, with the students, your debate prowess, the journal in which many of you have published amazing articles on interesting topics. You guys are doing something right here at the University of Houston, and you should be very proud. I was honored to be invited to give this talk celebrating Constitution Day. I have to admit immediately that I'm not a constitutional scholar. My wife, who taught American government, American politics for many years, she asked me what I was going to be doing in Houston yesterday, and I said, well, I'm giving this talk for Constitution Day. And she said, you're giving a talk on the Constitution? So I will refer to the Constitution in this talk. I will refer to the Federalist Papers. But I'm mostly going to be talking about some things that I've been concerned with a lot and publishing a lot on, which you could describe as the managerial state and its threat to our constitutional liberties. Some of you will no doubt find some of what I have to say provocative, and that's good, because if I'm not provoking you, I'm not encouraging you to think in ways that stretch your understanding. So I'm looking forward to, in particular, to the discussion period afterwards. Okay, so politics originated in democratic Athens, where citizens came together in courts and the assembly to debate and decide matters of common concern face to face. These activities were free and freewheeling, constrained only by basic rules of order. And while those who held office were often knee-deep in bribery, corruptions of the political process were primitive compared to today. Ancient politicians knew nothing of modern managerial science or the uses of digital technology to manipulate political attitudes and outcomes. The American founders were similarly graced with innocent simplicity. They aimed not to control citizens, but to govern them. In Federalist 9, Alexander Hamilton paid due respect to a new, quote, science of politics, end quote, one born of experience, informed by study, and rooted in prudence. And Hamilton wrote, the regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. These are wholly new discoveries, or have made their principal progress toward perfection in modern times. These were genuine advances that would have spared the Athenians much trouble. But power corrupts everything it touches, and political expertise is no exception. Plato, for one, understood this. In the Republic, he envisioned a ruling elite that proposes to manufacture citizens out of raw human material, metaphorically molding, stamping, tuning, and dyeing them, but also surveilling and censoring them, so as to fit the imperatives of the regime. These made-to-order citizens would in principle be of one mind on all important issues. The result would be a simulacrum of politics, expertly managed by an elite whose scientific knowledge is presumed to justify its power. The Republic proved to be a prophecy of late modern totalitarianism. Reflecting on the importance of indoctrination in the construction of the new Soviet man, Joseph Stalin remarked that poets are, quote, engineers of human souls, end quote. Writers who refused to subordinate their art to state propaganda risked dying in the gulag or with a bullet to the back of the skull. 3 decades after the fall of the USSR, soul engineering is more widespread than ever, but has advanced to the point where Stalinist brutality is unnecessary. Equipped with a new suite of managerial and psychological tools, amplified by digital technology and refined by big data, totalitarianism has emerged from a brief hibernation in the softer guise of a hovering, smothering mother, one that watches her children through digital surveillance, feeds them propaganda, and shields them with censorship. These are now core activities of the global managerial elite who oversee what, until just yesterday, were the liberal democracies of the West. In Federalist 47, James Madison wrote that, quote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." End quote. Just as God held back the waters of primeval chaos so as to fashion open spaces where human life could flourish, the Constitution of the United States kept tyranny at bay by dividing the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. This separation of powers created public middle grounds where citizens came together to decide common affairs and settle their disputes in peace. Today, however, tyrannical powers accumulate like greenish thunderclouds on the horizon. The Constitution was established, as its preamble explains, quote, "to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." Government is instead fusing with civil society and business in ways that recall Nietzsche's description of the state as the coldest of all cold monsters. This Leviathan, the 21st century total state, as the journalist Auron McIntyre calls it, is a faceless, highly complex, public-private network of ideologically aligned technocrats working in and moving seamlessly between government bureaucracies, think tanks, foundations, universities, non-governmental organizations, technology corporations, financial institutions, the media, and a broad range of cultural organizations. By a multitude of means, including debanking, the use of emergency powers, the weaponization of search engines, the compliance of social media platforms and news organizations, and the new industry of, quote, fact-checking, the total state suppresses and manipulates information, disseminates propaganda, and punishes those who resist it. Put bluntly, ordered liberty is an incrementally but steadily giving way to despotism, and citizens are becoming subjects. This is a reversal not only of the modern democratization of the West, but of the story that Aristotle tells about the historical emergence of politics. In the Politics, Aristotle explains, the first human communities were those composed of male and female, and master and slave. Master in Greek is despotes, the root of our word despot. When combined, these two communities formed the household, originally exemplified by the one-eyed monsters of the Odyssey. For just as each Cyclops, according to Homer, quote, acts as a law to his children and wives, end quote, men, Aristotle says, quote, were scattered and used to dwell this way in ancient times, end quote. But when Greek households eventually formed villages and villages came together in cities, Cyclopean despotism, the rule of force in which the word of one man only prevailed, ultimately gave way to politics. Whereas a household comes into being for the sake of living, Aristotle explains a city, polis, or political community, comes into being for the sake of living well. The members of a polis who share in ruling and being ruled are called politikoi, citizens. The political community is a community of speech, or logos, wherein individual citizens share their perceptions of what is good and bad, just and unjust. And this public sharing is an essential element of the good life. Yet, political communities are historically rare and fragile, and the ancient world was no exception. The Greek-speaking peoples were bordered by despotic empires, including pharaonic Egypt, and Persia, where everyone other than the supreme ruler was called, quote, the king's slave, end quote. Some of these slaves were wealthy and powerful aristocrats, but they lived at the mercy of a man-god, whose word, however arbitrary it might be, was law. This was the Cyclopean household writ large, not least because the office of big man was hereditary. Because their speech counted for nothing in the realm of political affairs, Egyptians, Persians, and other non-Greek peoples were subjects, not citizens. And only the Athenian-led defeat of the massive invading armies of Darius in 490 BCE and Xerxes in 480 saved politics from being murdered in its infancy by the Persian hegemon. 20th century despotism was in certain respects a reprise of the ancient sort. Just as the pharaohs were memorialized in massive stone sculptures and tombs, cults of personality effectively deified totalitarian rulers like Hitler and Stalin. The German theologians, for example, worked to fashion a new myth of Jesus as a forerunner of Nazism, presenting him as a spirited Christian warrior who strove heroically to destroy Judaism. They depicted Nazi ideology as the fulfillment of the original Christianity of Jesus and elevated Hitler to the status of the second coming of Christ, who would finish the work Jesus failed to complete, the extermination of Jews and Judaism. In China, the cult of the supreme leader filled the vacuum left by the communist war against traditional religions like Taoism. Families reconfigured altars in their homes to worship Mao, while the supreme ruler himself found it necessary to stop the production of aluminum buttons bearing his image, estimated at between 2 and 5 billion, because it was harming China's ability to make aircraft. The Third Reich and the USSR relied on extensive governmental bureaucracies to manage their populations. The emerging total state is also highly bureaucratic, and its power, too, is impersonal, diffuse, and unaccountable. But it dispenses with the figure of a man-god and is less reliant on fear and force. It exercises control through no office or agency, but in the seemingly spontaneous coordination of a great multitude of functionaries. We see this in the United States today. The myth that Joe Biden was, in his third year as president, in any meaningful sense competent to lead the executive branch of government, was aggressively promoted by Democratic leaders and a compliant media. It was dispelled when, after his disastrous performance in a debate with Donald Trump, the media and party leaders deemed him unfit to run for president, and he was summarily replaced by Kamala Harris. Once a mere figurehead, he is now a ghost, haunting the White House until his day of release. Biden's removal from the Democratic ticket and political erasure sharpens the question that many have been asking since 2020. Who is in charge? As in a Kafka novel, the vast machinery of the total state answers only in the echo of the question. This deliberate silence is itself a governing strategy employed by tyrants throughout history, who instinctively understood that discouraged and anxious people are easier to control than bold and confident ones. And this silence is just one way to sever or distort the bonds of free speech that constitute a political community. The Soviets turned the human word against the community so completely that in common parlance, the verb to write came to mean to produce a report for the secret police. We're not there yet, although the written word is commonly subjected to similar reports before it can be published. As Malcolm K. observes, creative writing now, quote, requires intercession from a class of moral managers, end quote. Racial equity consultants who vet book manuscripts and screenplays for ideological thought crime. And even in scientific fields, Western scholarly journals employ comparable ideological controls. These historical echoes to one side, the 21st century total state's technical refinement and novel application of managerial techniques is unprecedented. Here, the state is indebted to Frederick Winslow Taylor, the 19th century American mechanical engineer and founder of modern managerial science. The Bolsheviks, who valued efficiencies of production as much as any capitalists, adopted the industrial techniques of Taylorism and applied them to the management of Soviet peoples. Thanks to advances in digital technology, the total state has gone one better. It has effectively applied Taylorism to the engineering of souls. This little-known story deserves a wide hearing. Taylor believed that workers who retain control over the labor process would be less productive than those whose work is dictated, in the minutest particulars, by management. In his book, The Principles of Scientific Management, he explains how he increased the average amount of pig iron, these are chunks of iron, loaded by each laborer onto railway cars at the Bethlehem Steel Corporation from 12.5 tons per day to 47.5. Taylor's first step was, quote, the scientific selection of the workmen, end quote. After close operation, he selected from a pool of 75 laborers 4 men who appeared to be physically able to handle 47 tons of pig iron per day. He then, quote, and this is all from Taylor's book, looked up their history as far back as practicable, and through inquiries, and thorough inquiries were made as to the character, habits, and ambition of each of them, end quote. The man he chose from among these 4, a Pennsylvania Dutchman, whom Taylor called Schmidt, was unusually energetic and high-working, and, this is important, placed, quote, a very high value on $1, end quote. He took Schmidt aside and harangued him as follows, and this is Taylor's own report in his own dialect when he quotes Schmidt. Schmidt, are you a high-priced man? Well, I don't know what you mean. Oh, yes, you do. What I want to know is whether you're a high-priced man or not. Well, I don't know what you mean. Oh, come on now, you answer my questions. What I want to find out is whether you're a high-priced man or one of these cheap fellows here. Having badgered Schmidt, and it goes on at length, into agreeing that he was a high-priced man, one who deserved $1.85 per day rather than $1.15, which he was currently earning, Taylor told him that he had to follow the exact instructions of his manager from morning to night, to pick up a 92-pound pig, walk when told to do so, rest when told to do so, quote, and what's more, no back talk, end quote. After he succeeded in convincing Schmidt to lift and carry 95,000 pounds of iron a day, he followed this procedure with all the other workers, increasing productivity by 380% with a 62% increase in wages. Subjected to Taylor's psychological manipulation, Schmidt and his co-workers completely surrendered what little individual agency they had in performing their jobs, in return for which they received what, in real terms, was a massive cut in pay. Now consider how Taylorism operates today on Americans, 90% of whom, at least among adults, own smartphones that addictively connect them to the internet more than 4.5 hours per day on average, where they chase dopamine hits with ever-diminishing returns. The habits, tastes, and movements of every one of these people are electronically observed and manipulated far more closely than Taylor could have imagined at the turn of the 20th century. Their online histories are sold for a profit and fed into algorithms used to deliver curated information and elicit tailored emotional responses for commercial and political purposes. These inscrutable algorithms control individuals just as effectively as Taylor did with Schmidt, isolating them in social and political echo chambers so that they can be bent to the will of others. Add to this cancellation by social media swarms and memes, some driven by bots, search engine shadow bans, proliferating hate speech regulations, and the, quote, whole of society, end quote, machinations of the censorship industrial complex, and it becomes clear that it is possible to make people conform to the imperatives of the ruling elite by effectively cutting off their tongues and hands in the medium of cyberspace. Indeed, it would be hard to overemphasize the role of technology in the emergence of the total state. All who suffer under totalitarianism get in the habit of reading tea leaves. What did the interrogator's exact words imply about my husband's fate? Was the functionary who issues housing permits suggesting that I might receive one sometime soon? Is the man on the corner an agent dispatched by the state to spy on me? Today, we try to guess not only what the government has in store for us, but how the algorithms that control digital content work. A question that is to some extent unanswerable even by those who design them. More generally, we wonder what small parts of our private lives remain shielded from the electronic scrutiny of people who can harm us. These concerns will only increase as the digital revolution unfolds. Is there any way to stop, much less reverse, the advance of the total state? This year, the Supreme Court overturned the Chevron doctrine that federal agencies can interpret the meaning of statutes they have issued. And they found that states may not coerce banks to demonetize clients. This was a New York case where the government of New York State told a bank, you demonetize the NRA. You cannot have them as a client, or we will crawl up your rear end with regulatory investigation. And the Supreme Court decided 9-0, pretty amazing in this day of divided court, that was illegal, in violation of the Constitution. But apart from these legal victories, the prognosis is bleak. The basic problem is that managerialism is hostile to all organic communities, including political ones. In other words, to the living tissue of civilization itself. A managerial regime, N.S. Lyons writes in a review of McIntyre's book entitled The Total State, and this is a quote, is politically and culturally destructive, homogenizing and totalizing by nature. From its perspective, any independent institution, community, or association inherently hinders the uniform application of managerial techniques from above. Thick bonds of place and community, religious traditions, parental rights, unregulated markets, national borders, all must be dissolved and replaced with bureaucratic mechanisms until nothing is left between isolated, atomized individuals and the managerial state. This observation confirms a chilling prophecy of the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. In his 1846 book, Two Ages, Kierkegaard reflects on the modern tendency to think in increasingly abstract and quantitative terms. In this context, he warns that the late modern phenomenon of leveling, by which he means the progressive destruction of the concrete associations and communities that have sustained human beings for millennia, is, quote, a demon that no individual can control, end quote. And he goes on to say, no particular individual will be able to halt the abstraction of leveling. And he predicts that leveling will be a global phenomenon, driven by an ideological abstraction so extreme as to be utterly devoid of ethical and political content. Quote, not even national individuality will be able to halt it, he writes, for the abstraction of leveling is related to a higher negativity, pure humanity. It is this empty concept. So that was a quote. It is this empty concept, pure humanity, without respect for actually existing individuals and the thick bonds of which their lives are woven, that animates the angry mobs of Westerners whose call to globalize the Intifada expresses their implicit desire to destroy civilization as such. These throngs of deracinated nihilists are the correlate and logical consequence of the priorities of the managerial state. We may not be able to defeat the total state, but we are obliged to try. That means working to restore politics, liberate the human word, and renew the bonds of community. The good news is that these inseparable and reciprocally supporting activities are themselves integral to a good human life. As we undertake them, let us draw encouragement from the example of America's founders, whose practical wisdom in framing the Constitution gave us the precious gift of ordered liberty. Thank you. Be happy to take questions.
We saved plenty of time for questions, and you invited some pushback.
Yeah, I sure did. Yeah.
What's despotism? Despotism.
Despotism?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it comes from the Greek word despotes, which means a master of slaves. And despotism is basically one man or one governing authority that has absolute control. It's a kind of absolute control without the input of the populace, right?
So like totalitarianism?
Mm-hmm. You could use the word despotism. The ancients make a distinction between despotism and tyranny. They use tyranny for a society of citizens that has been taken over by such a ruler. And they use despotism to refer to states where there is no tradition anymore of politics or citizenship. Yeah.
No undergraduates? So, once again, thank you for the excellent speech. As I said, I certainly enjoyed the reference to McIntyre's book, which I had the privilege of reading over the summer. But much like with my McIntyre on Twitter, I shall phrase this question to you here.
Sure.
It's not the issue with the total state that I much critiques, that the issues are in part just that it is being misused, that we dislike these outcomes, we dislike the politicizing of it. But at its core, the total state is a machine of efficiency, a machine which uses things to achieve ends and goals. So is not it merely a tool that is in the process of being misused, and thus something that rather than aiming to destroy, we should instead aim to simply use correctly? You know, your comment on Biden, I think, was illustrates this precise point, that right now the machine is in some ways masterless. Would not simply the installing of a good master for the system be much more potent and useful to society than its destruction?
Well, keep in mind that what I call the total state is a fusion of government with society, okay? And when you have, for example, and this has been exposed in the Twitter files, when you have the government saying to Facebook, the Hunter Biden laptop story, you got to get rid of all references to that, right? And when you have them saying, you know, or when you have, let's just take that example. That's illicit, probably illegal. And what you're doing is you're weaponizing a supposedly independent organization to do your bidding, right? As the government. So that's a big part of the problem right there. You know, efficiency is always the argument that's used to support sort of incremental removals of liberties or sort of shrinking of the zone of liberty, right? So, I mean, it really is remarkable. This is simply objective. It's not a question of what political side you're on. Objectively speaking, you can look and you can see that the media moves in lockstep with the Democratic Party. I mean, fundamentally, right? If you simply look at positive references to candidates, negative references, if you look at the way stories are spun, if you look at these things, what you have, and incidentally, don't underestimate the role of the media. Like, it's super important. And Google algorithms, you know, you search for something and boom, it gives you, like actually doing some research for this, I would type in things like censorship and, you know, industrial complex, things like this. I mean, it's stuff that I know a lot about, but I want to make sure I'm checking references. And the stuff that comes up in Google is always pro-censorship. In fact, it was funny. There was a woman named Nina Jankowicz who was supposed to be appointed the czar of a new federal commission that was going to be, like, I forget what they called it, but like they had some innocuous name that was going to be censoring information. And I published an article recently on the censorship industrial complex, which is a name that, you know, Matt Taibbi or Michael Schellenberger or Mike Benz or one of the people who knows all about this came up with. And this was in City Journal. They decided to illustrate it with a picture of Nina Jankowicz. I don't know, 2 hours later, I get an email from Nina Jankowicz, okay, who's, by the way, a bizarre person. I mean, she She's the one who sang to the tune of Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, a song about censorship. And she said, you have to remove my face from this. I'm absolutely not for censorship. I'm simply for, proper news, blah, blah, blah. And the magazine caved. They took her picture off of it. And then a number of people posted my article to Facebook where it was removed. Okay? Now, what's going on there? My guess, Nina Jankowicz is hooked in. And she's like, take that off Facebook. That's not a free society. Now, that's very minor, by the way. That's very, very minor. But when you see, media and big tech and all these organizations kind of moving, and, it's all very opaque because who exactly is in charge, right? So what you're suggesting is, let's get a good person and put them in charge of these powerful tools. But you can see the problem with that, which is what happens when you have a bad person in charge of it, right? And anyway, aside from that, the fact is that we are being spied on all the time. I mean, you actually probably can't be too paranoid about this. I'm quite serious.
Well, one thing, I as I said, I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But this is my cheating preference for a clear decision.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah. Yeah.
So at the end, you talk about restoring politics and the liberation of speech. How do we do that?
We do it with, this is part of it. I mean, here's the horrible thing. We have to rebuild these organic communities. Now, there's a whole, these voluntary associations that Tocqueville saw when he came to the United States in the 1830s. And, I mean, he praised the Americans, said, it's unbelievable. Wherever you go in the United States, they have a common interest. They form a club. They see a political problem. Boom, they form an association. They tackle it, right? Now, and what I was trying to suggest in this talk, and the talk has a lot of problems, okay? But what I was trying to suggest is we got political and ideological forces, and we have technological forces. And the technological forces are eating away our agency. I mean, when I read that over 90% of adults have smartphones that they spend 4.5 hours a day on average, that's insane, okay? And what happens there is when you start, let's say, responding to whatever is coming along, swipe left, swipe right, swipe left, swipe right, swipe left, swipe. You understand what I'm trying to say? I'm not going to try to say it again. Swipe left, swipe right, thumbs up, thumbs down. These are all binary reactions. You're behaving like a machine. And not just that, as we get AI, used to be, when I was young, you had to use a map to drive. Man, I paid attention to my surroundings. Because it's not that easy. Like you're in a big city like Houston. I got to go halfway across the city. Got to study the map. You can't be looking at it all the time as you're driving. So you're like, okay, yeah, take a left at the Chevron, stuff like this. Now with GPS, like people they can't figure out where they are. So you like outsource ChatGPT. You outsource your writing abilities and so forth. So this makes us passive. It makes us subject in a literal sense, which is also the political sense, to these outside forces. And then it sort of weaponizes these political movements. Yeah.
You keep giving me problems. You're
Yeah.
not giving me solutions.
Oh,
what does the
sorry.
organic community?
Sorry. I got carried away. So what happens is one more element of the problem. We become atomized. Okay, we become kind of almost infantilized, and we're relying on. So what do we have to do? We have to revive our capacities to relate face to face to human beings. We have to revive our capabilities to, and it's going to take some virtues, to speak for ourselves, to share our opinions directly, right? Without fear of reprisal. We have to be able to sort of get that can-do spirit about like, okay, we got a problem here in this town. Let's get people together and write petitions and go to the city managers' meetings and things like this. We have to begin reviving this political activism, if you like, something like that. Talks, discussions, sharing ideas where we don't agree with each other. And this kind of builds networks, right, between human beings. I mean, one of the problems was, COVID, that produced very interesting consequences. A lot of people who left work during COVID haven't come back because they realize, well, we can do our work at home. Now, one thing that, like, a workplace is a place where you don't, it's not it's not voluntary in the following sense. I don't choose my coworkers. Someone else does, right? So, you know, you might have people of all sorts of different persuasions and all sorts of different religions and you have to, you know, like, this is a very diverse community here. So this is good, right? Like we mix and match and we like talk and we're like, you know, you're like, oh, I think Trump's an idiot, or I think Biden's an idiot. And then you talk to someone who has the other point of view. And you start forming these intangible bonds that can constitute communities. And so just build it up from the ground. The problem is you got a machine on top that's like a scythe cutting down a forest. And what we have to do is regrow the forest with the mosses and the grasses and all the organic stuff that makes this living whole.
I mean, right, when you talk about networks and
Mhm.
communities,
Mhm.
can technology play a role in that at all?
I mean, it can play a role in that, right? And the thing is, I am not suggesting, I'm no Luddite. You know, the Luddites were these guys who smashed these were hand loom weavers who in the early 19th century, when they started going to power looms, would smash the power looms because it put them out of work. We can't go back. You know, I mean, maybe you guys read Rousseau. I don't know if you do, but you know, someone's like, well, is Rousseau saying in the first discourse that we got to get rid of tech? Like, that's ridiculous. We can't do it, right? But what can we do? Well, here's another thing. We can be conscious of our dependence on these machines and our dependence on sources of information. We can begin to seek out, I'm glad you asked, we can begin to seek out other sources of information as well, right? It's good, like there's lots of great podcasts on now, and listen to ones that, you know, you wouldn't ordinarily maybe, like the ones that aren't suggested to you in your algorithm, right? And so yes, I know it's ironic, technology is doing this, but I think if we can increase face-to-face associations, which is why it's really important, by the way, to have classrooms where you can talk to people. So, you know, anything that is that in some respect widens your understanding and your connections with actual human beings. And yes, I think technology can help that in some cases for sure.
Can I ask you to agree? I'm glad you brought up Alexis de Tocqueville, and you return to that for just 1 second. Because the examples that you were using of the previous iterations of a totalitarian state were non-democratic.
Yeah.
But Tocqueville seems to suggest, even before those examples you were pointing to, that the real threat is with a democratic polity submitting itself to a soft despotism as a totalitarian state.
Right.
So I wonder whether or not you think that what's happening in the United States is not just another example of totalitarianism in a softer version, but is actually an endemic part of the progress of a democratic state.
It may be now, I'm glad that you raised this question. This is at the end of Democracy in America, and he is very worried about this soft totalitarianism, and it has to do with dependence on the state, right? And he sort of compares it to like, dogs on a leash or something like that, And this is another problem, by the way, of technology, because it has given us all kinds of entertainment, and sort of distractions and things like this. As Rousseau would put it, sort of like, sprinkled flowers over our chains or something like this. Let's talk about our democracy. We have two major parties, neither of which really represent the interests of the American people. And so another thing you can do, and I'm just throwing this out, is vote for RFK. He's on the ballot. Why? You say why? Well, because he's the third party. And because what he's trying to do is say there have to be more parties. And this is not unprecedented. There have been new parties in the United States, right? And it wasn't that long ago, we had a guy named Ross Perot who was concerned about the national debt, something that's in the rearview mirror. Back then, do you remember what the debt was then? Around $4 billion or $4 trillion or something. Now it's like 32 trillion or some crazy thing. So to somehow, because what we have is a kind of self-serving relationship between two massive parties that are sort of in a kind of equilibrium, and we need a greater plurality of voices. I think that's something that would be helpful. Yeah.
Hi, so you spoke of the censorship of media, but what about the censorship of literature? What does that say about
Very bad.
weaponization of the Constitution?
Yeah, no, I mean, literature, look, it's, I mean, you know, we live in a culture where there's fear about people taking offense at things or harming, you know, like the psyches of young readers and things like this. And I oppose any kind of censorship of literature. And, you know, within the framework of the Constitution, we should have our liberties. But another thing that I oppose, not oppose, but here's another way technology comes in. People read less. And, I mean, in a way, there are alternatives. Like I tell students, listen to books on tape, because you can do that when you're exercising or when you're driving or something like this. And it's actually really interesting, even just as a supplement to what you're reading. You know, like I've taught the Iliad 100 times, but if you listen to it on tape, you're like, wow, I never thought about that, just because of the way the reader's doing it and the way the story's hitting you. So yeah, I think that, you know, decisions to not publish a book because, or to you know, go through a book and get rid of passages and things like this, it's really and it all goes back to this thing I said about speech, logos, right? If you read the Bible, you know, God divides the world through speech, and then speech is like the first thing we see the human being that God has created do, we don't hear him, is he names the animals, he uses speech. Speech is absolutely essential from the Greek and the biblical perspective. Why do we want to interfere with our speech? And then, you know, one of the things I hope all you students do will be to develop your own individual voice. You know, like work on your writing, work on your speaking, and find your own style, which I've been talking to people about this here, you know. Imagine if you wrote or spoke in a way that even if somebody didn't see your name on the thing, they'd go, oh, that's this person, because you've got your distinctive voice. And when I see literature being censored, it's like it's not about the individual. It's, you know, we don't care what you have to say. It's got to fit these patterns that we want to impose. And that's tyrannical as well. Yeah.
So let's take maybe one more question, and then we'll let you get out of here for your next class. Go ahead.
So you spoke of the evil of two parties, though historically the United States tends to fall into having two parties because of the electoral system and because this system tends to breed two parties. Even when there is a third party, it knocks one of the two major ones out. So there's always been two parties, and it seems that as long as we do have the electoral system, we are going to continue to have two parties.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. And I can see the logic of it because, you know, first the Republicans were concerned that RFK was going to take votes from them, and now the Democrats are concerned. The point is, they don't want anybody else, right? So I don't, you know, but I don't know. I mean, if your question is, should we get rid of the Electoral College or something like that, I think there are problems with that, right? Because what will happen is, if you just look at the map, you're going to have basically the domination of, you know, the American political scene by huge states with large populations that are going to reflect those states' interests. And here we get into the problem of the tyranny of the majority, right? That Madison and Hamilton were concerned about. So, I mean, you know, one thing about politics is there are no permanent political solutions. There's just a constant kind of juggling. There's a constant, you know, you have to, it's a constant set of compromises. And I don't know, you know, I guess I would be very hesitant to make any fundamental changes to the structure of the United States, certainly not to the Constitution, you know, to solve these problems. I think the problems would be diminished if we had better education, better civics education, a better informed public, and one that's less manipulated. I was talking to a political consultant, by the way, this was a year ago, and this guy said, oh man, with artificial intelligence and big data, especially big data, they've got things so well pegged that these big parties can target not just a state or a county, but like a particular town, let's say, with certain kinds of ads and stuff. And they can manipulate things. And I don't doubt it, you know. And that's a very serious problem. How do you counter that? Well, you've got people who are informed, and they can make up their own minds. So.
Maybe that's a good point to end on, but before we go, I wanted to mention two things.
Professor Howland has pointed out that voluntary associations for some common good are a useful thing. The Honors College once had an initiative to change the name of Calhoun Road off campus. If you'd like to join that initiative, which kind of died during COVID because you couldn't go around and gather names, come see me, because that's something that we would like to get the city of Houston to do, change the name of Calhoun Road off campus. The second thing, if you're interested in electoral college and the upcoming election, Prognosis is going to host a number of events over October, as well as on election night, so be looking for that. But please right now help me to thank Professor Howland.